All right. Well, again, thank you and welcome back to our second installment of this Catholic American history series. As we're going through today, we're kind of jumping right along from where we left off in January, going along chronologically. And this one I've entitled Catholics and the Birth of the Nation, as we look at particularly the Revolutionary War, and we'll talk a little bit at the end about the post-war beginnings of the nation and the rise of the Catholic Church around that time. But as we've done before, let's enter into this time with a prayer for the nation, part of the prayer for the nation that was written by the first Bishop of the United States, who we'll be talking about tonight, Bishop John Carroll. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. We pray, O Almighty and eternal God, who through Jesus Christ has revealed thy glory to all nations, to preserve the works of your mercy, that your church, being spread through the whole world, may continue with unchanging faith in the confession of your name. Let the light of your divine wisdom direct the deliberations of Congress and shine forth in all the proceedings and laws framed for our rule and government, so that they may tend to the preservation of peace, the promotion of national happiness, the increase of industry, sobriety, and useful knowledge, and may perpetuate to us the blessing of equal liberty. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, to get us started, I just want to get the cobwebs out of our ears, refresh us a little bit, or a little bit of a remedial course for those who are joining us for the first time tonight. So you might recall in January, I spent a lot of time talking about the three sources of Catholicism in the United States, or at least what would become the United States, as we focused on the colonial and early colonial periods, stretching from Columbus in 1492 all the way up to the mid-1700s on the cusp of the American Revolution. And these three influences of Spain, France, and the thrown out English Catholics really come together, as we'll see a little bit later on, not just in the original 13 colonies, which were predominantly coming from the English side, although some coming from the French and a little bit from the Spanish as well. But as we'll see later on, these influences really determine a lot of what we take and what we experience in the Catholic Church still. And as we spoke about these three sources, Spain coming up through the conquests in Mexico, France coming from the missionaries through Canada and Quebec into the northeastern United States and much of the Midwest Great Lakes region, and the English coming into the Maryland colony, the colony that was set up by Lord Baltimore to be a place of refuge not only for Catholics, but a place of religious freedom for all. In many ways, being a light, being a source for what the American Revolution would later embody, seeking a freedom for all peoples, freedom for all religions. And as I briefly mentioned, and as we saw through the laws of particularly the English colonies, there is this deep anti-Catholic prejudice that is predominant, particularly among the English colonies, and still to some lesser degree in the other colonies as well. Maybe not necessarily anti-Catholic, but some weariness from the governors, from the secular world, about the role of clergy, about the role of the missionaries, both in France to the Indians, to the Native Americans, and in New Spain to the natives there as well. And this anti-Catholic prejudice, John Tracy Ellis, one of the great American Catholic historians, said is the predominant and the first prejudice and the longest standing still in the United States. And we'll see in our talk this evening that beginning to break down, and the Catholics being able to bring forth, true freedom, true justice, and showing the other Protestants what they can actually do, how they can actually help to form a united nation. So when we're talking about this American Revolution and talking about the role of Catholics at this time, it can be quite easy for us to forget the timeline, or for us to get slipped up. We're talking really about 2 to 3 decades of time. So while in January we talked about all the way from 1492 to about 1740, 250 years, today we're really going to be covering more or less 4, maybe 5 decades. So we've much more condensed down, and we're looking at a much more narrower scope here. So to remind you a little bit of your American history class, maybe in junior high or high school or college, kind of the first seeds of the American Revolution, not having to do with anything Catholic per se, is in 1763-65. We have the end of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as it was called in Europe. This treaty, the end of this war between England and France and France's allies in North America. And really it's from there that the British are trying to make up some of their losses, making up some of the money that they've spent in this war. And that's where they begin to pass the Stamp Act in 1765, the tax on tea, all these things that the Americans quickly became to resent as they were being occupied and as they were forced to pay these taxes. As the saying goes, taxation without representation. So in 1768, British troops occupy Boston, the city of Boston, as unrest continues to rise. And in 1770 is the Boston Massacre, which really is a great spark for the American Revolution. Maybe to a lesser degree known as in 1772, we have what we call the Committees of Correspondence, which in some way are mini declarations of independence, or mini requests from the states or just the simple colonies at the time, looking to find a way to resolve these problems that the British monarchy are imposing on them, and finding ways of corresponding to the United Kingdom, and finding ways of peace, or ways to find representation or freedom in a diplomatic way. And then 1773 is the Boston Tea Party, and 74, the year after, is the establishment of the Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress, which will pass the Declaration of Independence, but really beginning this Continental Congress, this meeting of representatives from all the 13 colonies, really begins this idea of independence and this war that will kick off at the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775. So that's kind of the background, the events leading up to the 4th of July, 1776, for us to keep in mind, particularly as we're talking about what the role of Catholics was in the war and where Catholics found themselves between the Protestant Americans and the Anglican English, these ways that they were trying to find a balance in what they were to do. So if we were to kind of catch a glimpse, give a little witness or snapshot of Catholicism in the colonies right before or on the eve of the Revolution, we would see that it is predominantly urban-centered. As I spoke of last time, one and then the second only public churches of the Catholics that were allowed were in the city of Philadelphia. There were private chapels in Maryland and to a lesser degree in New York that would hold Catholics, that would allow Catholics to worship when a priest was available. That really wasn't very often. And as far as what the makeup of Catholics was, the Catholics were somewhere in the range of 20,000 to 25,000 people, which is less than 1% of the total population in the colonies at the time. And for all 20 to 25,000 people, there were 23 priests right on the edge of the American Revolution, largely ministering in Maryland, most of them in Maryland, a handful in Pennsylvania, especially in Philadelphia, and 1 or 2 in New York. And these priests, we think of priests in parishes today where we're in a small geographical area, but all of these priests, whether they were old or young, no matter if they were sick or healthy, they were traveling constantly. Most Catholics didn't have regular access to the sacraments, and most were lucky to go to Mass once a month, if not only a couple times a year. So Catholicism, particularly at this time in America, was very much what we might think of as a private devotion, as a private faith where families themselves or small communities of families gathered together were really responsible for keeping the faith alive. Priests would come, spend a couple days with the community, hear their confessions, say Mass, maybe do weddings and baptisms, and then move on. And they weren't exactly sure the next time that a priest would come around. Now, if you were in an urban center like Philadelphia, you had the regular churches that were established there, as well as in some of the Potomac areas of Maryland. Now, all 23 of these priests were Jesuits. All of them were from the Society of Jesus. Every once in a while, they would get a diocesan priest to come in, but most of the time he was French, and he was merely passing through on his way to Quebec, onto Montreal, or back to France itself. And because all of these priests themselves were Jesuits, it really was a shock and a blow to the American Catholic community when the Jesuits themselves were suppressed. Maybe you're not familiar with the history of the Jesuits, but in July of 1773, again, right on the cusp of the American Revolution, and maybe in some way adding to the idea of freedom and justice of the Catholics as well, Pope Clement XIV decided to suppress the Jesuits for a number of reasons, most of them being political or national. By 1773, Jesuits had been expelled by numerous kings and queens of Europe. They'd been expelled from Spain and Spanish territories, from France, and from many other areas throughout Europe. And most of it had to do with the power that Jesuits controlled, not necessarily political power, but most kings and nobles were a little jealous of the power that Jesuits held in running great schools, in being sources of education. This is around the time of the Enlightenment, and many Jesuits were promoters of the Enlightenment ideas of freedom and justice that in many ways went against the absolute monarchs at the time. So for these and a whole slew of other reasons, the Jesuits were suppressed in 1773, but members of the society continued to minister. All 23 of those priests that were present in the United States continued to fulfill their mission, continued to allow the sacraments to be there for the people throughout the time of the suppression. And the society also flourished in Poland and in Russia, where the Pope's decree of suppression of the Jesuits was pretty much ignored. So the Jesuits really survived in little pockets here and there, even when the name Society of Jesus couldn't be used. But as I said, this is important because all of the priests themselves were Jesuits, and you can imagine what this would have done to their own morale as they were part of this larger community, as they saw themselves as really the infantrymen of the Pope, being loyal to the Pope in all ways. And then the Pope goes and suppresses them, pushes them to the side. You can imagine how they might desire in their own way, in their own personal lives, to seek after the principles of freedom of religion and justice and equality that were starting to brew among the American colonies. And it's also at this time that we see a number of changing ideas and sentiments towards Catholics. As newspapers are becoming more and more prolific in the colonies, there's anti-Catholics and Catholics alike who are writing in these newspapers anti-Catholics sometimes lambasting and arguing against the Catholic religion, and then the Catholics, most notably Charles Carroll, who we'll talk about later on, writing and defending the truths and their stance of the Catholic faith. In fact, I have an excerpt from one of Charles Carroll's newspaper submissions that I'll look at here. So in 1773, and he had been doing it for a number of years prior and many years after, Charles Carroll was writing against a man who went by the pen name of Antillon, who was another kind of political commentator, man of means in the colonies, who was writing against the Catholics. And he, Charles Carroll, always referred to himself as the citizen. So you can see, even in his mindset, even on the cusp of the revolution, he wasn't necessarily identifying himself as the Catholic citizen, but rather the citizen or the first citizen, recognizing the place among Catholics in the new nation. He says, "We Catholics who think we were hardly treated on occasion, we still remember the treatment, though our resentment hath entirely subsided." You might recall from last time I talked about how in Maryland, in Virginia, and particularly in Massachusetts, there were laws against Catholics, the penal laws against the Pope, against Catholic, and against priests particularly, that in many cases the sentence was death. And how many priests or Catholics died by this, we're not exactly sure, probably very few, because there really were no Catholics in Massachusetts. And the priests had no reason to go there except if they were shipwrecked, and Massachusetts was at least merciful enough to put in some exceptions to that rule. But Charles Carroll goes on to say, "It is not in the least bit surprising that a man incapable of forming an exalted sentiment should not readily comprehend the force and beauty of one." So you say this is how so many times people debated in the colonial times. There were open debates, but it was often with these pointed opinion pieces in the newspapers. And he goes on to say that it's very inconsistent that one owes toleration to the government and favor to the government, but will not give that favor, will not give that toleration to even one's own co-religionists in the Christian faith. And you see, so this was read far and wide throughout the colonies, not just in Charles Carroll's own Maryland colony. And it begins to soften some hearts. One of the things that's occurring at this time outside of the American colonies is in Quebec, there's the passage of the Freedom of Religion Act that was passed by the British to allow the Catholics in Quebec to freely follow their religion, Quebec being handed over to the British following the defeat of the French in the French and Indian War. And it's from this standpoint, the Americans are seeing this, and there's split opinion on this piece. Many colonists, Catholic and non-Catholic, are excited about it, are happy to see that the British are putting some freedoms in place, are willing to be tolerant in some cases, hoping that maybe some of that will come to the colonies as well. While others see it as they would say, the evil popery or the evil Catholics slowly slipping their feet in the door to steal back the power, to steal back all this that they had fought so much to get rid of. And this sentiment kind of goes back and forth over these pre-revolutionary years. And as we get closer to the time of 1776, when the First and Second Continental Congresses are meeting, many of the delegates would find themselves going to different churches around the city of Philadelphia where they were meeting, many times going to each other's churches to kind of experience something different between the Anglicans, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, all these religious that were in the city of Philadelphia. And John Adams writes a very interesting letter to his wife, Abigail, about his attendance of a Catholic Mass. And it's really interesting to hear how he describes it. So he attended a Catholic Mass in October of 1774. So again, just on the cusp of the Revolution. He says, "This afternoon, led by curiosity and good company, I strolled away to Mother Church, or rather Grandmother Church. I mean the Romish chapel. We often call Rome, Mother Church or coming home to Mother, but he says Grandmother Church. He says, I heard a good short moral essay upon the duty of parents to their children, founded in justice and charity, to take care of their interests, temporal and spiritual. Before telling his wife about the Catholic service, he's telling her about a Presbyterian service that he went to that he found to be quite boring and the preaching pretty bad. So for him to bring up the preaching of the Catholics says something. He says, this afternoon's entertainment was to me most awful. The poor wretches fingering their beads, chanting Latin, not a word of which they understood. Their Pater Nosters and Ave Marias, their holy water, their crossing themselves perpetually, their bowing to the name of Jesus whenever they hear it. Their bowings, kneelings, and genuflections upon the altar, the dress of the priest, his pulpit of velvet and gold, the altarpiece of little images and crucifixes, wax candles. But he goes on to say, but how shall I describe the picture of our Savior in a frame of marble over the altar, at full length upon the cross in the agonies, and the blood dropping and streaming from his wounds? The music, consisting of an organ and a choir of singers, went all the afternoon except sermon time, and the assembly chanted most sweetly and exquisitely. Here's everything which can lay hold of the eye, ear, and imagination, everything which can charm and bewitch the simple and ignorant. I wonder how Luther ever broke the spell. Adieu. So you can see, John Adams, who we think of as very highly, being president of the United States, first vice president, all these things, a great founding father. If you read some of his other writings, he was terribly anti-Catholic. So the very fact that he attended a Catholic Mass and wrote maybe not the best, but not also the worst reflection on it, I think really says something to the changing sentiments that are happening at this time. Another thing that is happening at this time, again, right before the Declaration of Independence is submitted, is written, we have these own declarations of freedoms, of rights set out by different colonies. So these happen to be after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but the thought is there beforehand. So Pennsylvania in 1776, not surprising, Pennsylvania being founded by the Quakers as a place of religious liberty, and Maryland in 1776. But Massachusetts itself, writing in their Constitution that instilling in their Constitution a right and freedom of religion for a happiness of all peoples, for the good of the order and preservation of civil government, they depend essentially upon piety, religion, and morality. And we must allow for piety, religion, and morality to promote the happiness, secure the common good, and preserve the government of the Commonwealth, of all the people, of all the faiths in the Commonwealth. So these we see, particularly in Massachusetts, already one of the most anti-Catholic when it comes to the laws before the Revolution, is at the same time softening, and we're beginning to see these freedoms come up. And these freedoms are not only good for the Catholics, of course, but for all those who were being persecuted at the time. There could be a whole series about the works of the Jewish people in the American Revolution, in the American nation, and they're going through much of the same persecution at this time as well. So we quickly move from these changing sentiments, these changing ideas, into the actual time of the Declaration of Independence. And as I alluded to earlier, it was signed by the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. We all know July 4th, 1776. And there were 56 signers of the Declaration, and one Catholic among them. I've already mentioned his name, Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Carrollton being the town or the manor that he was from, because he was the third in the generations of Carrolls who had been in the United States, and so they kind of had their own little Carroll enclave. And he's related, he's a cousin of Bishop John Carroll, and we'll talk about the whole Carroll family in just a short time. And to give a preview of what's to come of Charles, he is a really important figure, not only for the Catholics, but he is a great founding father as well. As I said, he was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration. He and his family were plantation owners in Maryland, and they were said to be the wealthiest family, the wealthiest people in the United States and the colonies at the time. Their family came from Ireland, coming from lawyers and farmers. He was educated by the Jesuits in France, being sent over to France to study for many years. And he allowed the Maryland Catholics to gather in his private chapel at his residence for Mass, for confessions, for everything that the Catholics might need. And at the time of his death, he died in 1832, and he was born in 1737, so he was quite old when he passed. He was the richest man in America, having then about 2.1 million pounds, which today we would equate to about $375 million. So, and interestingly, dying in 1832, he is the last survivor of the Declaration of Independence. So in many ways, his death in 1832 ends kind of the period of the Founding Fathers that so many American historians talk about. And I'm going to go on and on about the Carrolls here shortly. So the signing of the Declaration, we could have talks and talks just on its importance alone. But as we've already been talking, it shows this great work among the American colonists coming together as the 13 colonies to pass this declaration, to pass this first step in our nation's history. And even if it's just in one man, we see the Catholic Church, the Catholic faith there and present and influential in many ways. You might be familiar with this 1818 painting by John Trumbull of the Declaration of Independence, the signing of it, hanging in Congress. And we see not all of the delegates at the Congress were depicted in the painting, but Charles Carroll was. So he's kind of not easy to see, but let's zoom in a little bit. And there he is. So maybe not the easiest to see when you're actually looking at the painting, not one of the prominent figures in the foreground, but still leaving his mark, making his presence known in this great painting. Now, among the other celebrations going on for the 250th anniversary of the United States, the White House, in collaboration with the National Archives and other organizations, have been putting together little videos about all the Founding Fathers. And I just want to share this very short video on Charles Carroll that gives you a little bit of a perspective on him and gives me a little bit of a break. So they have... The White House has put out videos, I think, on most, if not all, of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and I think they're nice little videos. But as he said, as being one of, if not the wealthiest signer of the Declaration and single person in the colonies at the time, he really did have much to lose. But he knew, and particularly being backed up by his writings in newspapers beforehand, he was a firm believer in this. But as I mentioned, Charles Carroll is not the only of the Carroll family that's important in our discussion. So the very first Carroll, Charles Carroll I, or Charles Carroll the settler, came to the United States, or came to the American colonies in the 1600s. He was a friend of Lord Baltimore, or at least of one of the successors of Lord Baltimore. And he himself was a lawyer, he was a merchant, he was a plantation owner, he was kind of an all-around businessman. And it's from him and from his manner and settlement that he established that really much of the Catholic faith grew in Maryland. He settled in Maryland on the Potomac and really helped to grow the Catholic faith by building private chapels, by helping fund and support priests in their ministry. And we see from him kind of two splits and two lines of the Carrolls, all of whom are important in their own way. So his son, Charles Carroll II, was another great landowner and great wealthy man in the colonies. And again, he was a great promoter of the faith and helping to support priests and other Catholics giving to the churches in Philadelphia as they were starting to grow. And his son, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, or Charles Carroll III, was who we just spoke of. This first and only Catholic signer of the Declaration, great founding father, last to die of the signers of the Declaration, and wealthiest man in the United States. Certainly very influential, both politically and economically in his own right, as he continued to support the Catholic Church and continued to support the endeavors of the faith throughout the colonies. On the other side of the Carroll family, another one of Charles Carroll, the first family members, or one of his sons rather, had two sons himself. One of them being Daniel Carroll, who was both a member of the Second Continental Congress, being elected after the Declaration of Independence was signed, so he himself not signing it. But he was a delegate from Maryland to the first Congress, to the first American Congress after the war. He was one of only 5 people to sign both the Articles of Confederation and the Declaration, or not the Declaration, the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution. So only 5 men signed both of those documents, and he being one of them, a great Catholic in his own way, being a great representative of the state of Florida, state of Maryland, as the United States developed. And then his brother, who held so much influence on his own, was John Carroll, first Father John Carroll, and then Bishop John Carroll, and later Archbishop as he became the Archbishop of Baltimore. But John Carroll deserves a talk just on his own. You know, we're familiar with his name because of the university here in Cleveland, and it's no wonder that the Jesuits decided to name the university here in Cleveland after John Carroll, because he himself was a Jesuit, as I mentioned. All 23 of the priests in the colonies at the time were Jesuits, or by that time former Jesuits. And John Carroll himself was really the superior. He was the one that was looked upon as being kind of a great figure, a great leader in his own right and for the community. So he lived from 1735 to 1815. And when he joined the Jesuits in 1753, he began to study in France and spent 2 decades in France, first being a student himself and then becoming a teacher and a headmaster at their school there. But when the society was suppressed in 1773, he returned to the United States, where he really became this leader among the former Jesuits in the colonies, and really this great speaker, this great promoter of the Catholic faith. And in 1789, he was made the first bishop in the United States. We'll talk about the founding of the Diocese of Baltimore here shortly. But John Carroll and Charles Carroll and the Catholics weren't simply great politicians, but they were doing a lot of legwork as well. In fact, Charles Carroll and John Carroll were part of this great expedition, really the first diplomatic mission of the fledgling United States, or at least of the colonies, as they went on a mission to Quebec. And whereas they had seen this freedom of religion passed by the British for the people in Quebec, for the people in Canada, as maybe a blessing and a curse, they still saw the colonists, the people in Quebec, as possible great allies in their war for freedom, in their desire to be free of British oppression. In fact, many of the residents of Quebec were of French ancestry and had only recently become members of the British Crown. And as I said, this was really America's first diplomatic mission, headed by America's foremost diplomat, Benjamin Franklin, as well as then Father John Carroll, his cousin Charles, and another representative from Maryland, not a Catholic but a Protestant, was Samuel Chase. And these four men went to Quebec, John Carroll going along to try to convince the bishop in Quebec to support the movement as well. And this, while it failed, it didn't convince the French to follow after. In fact, maybe it was ill-timed, because when they went on the expedition, it was only soon after the American colonists had tried to invade Quebec and tried to lay siege to Quebec to take the city for their own in their war. So maybe it was not the best timing to send a diplomatic mission to try to convince them to join the side of the people who were just attacking them. But still, it shows this interest not only among these four individuals, but the whole Continental Congress and the whole group of founding fathers who had to give their permission, who had to help fund the trip. And they saw that even though the Canadians were largely Catholic, they saw that despite this religion that many of them detested, they were able to find great allies. And this same thought process would help them later on as they got the allyship of the French in the war. So we're coming up on really a great aspect of our American Catholic history in the Revolutionary War. There were countless Catholics in the military, countless military leaders who had Catholic roots and Catholic tradition, and I'm going to go through a number of them. But we're about halfway through the talk right now, so I think what I'm going to let us do is maybe get up for a few minutes, stretch. All right, I don't want our break to eat too much into our discussion tonight, or it's really less of a discussion, more of a monologue, but that's okay. So before I get into the great Catholic military leaders, I want to first go back a few steps and give you some great quotes here from some of the founding fathers. So thinking back to some of the pre-revolutionary views still of Catholics, thinking all the way back to the Stamp Act and the taxes imposed on the British colonies, Samuel Adams, known not just for his beer, but for his patriotism as well, he said, "Much more is to be dreaded from the growth of popery in America than from the Stamp Act." So you see, this anti-Catholic sentiment is quite deep-rooted, as we had mentioned. But as I mentioned, John Adams, who was maybe one of the most outspoken anti-Catholics at the time, he said this about Charles Carroll. He said, being impressed by how much he was able to risk, particularly his large fortune, he says, "He continues to hazard his all, his immense fortune, the largest in America, and his very life." So you see, even, he doesn't say, despite him being a Catholic or despite his evil popery or something. So There is movement going on there. There is some change coming about. But to get into the very heart of some of these great Catholic military leaders, I'm not a military historian, so I can't go into all the detail of all the battles and sieges in the Revolutionary War, even though I love reading about it, love looking at the different maps and such. There's a fair number of great Catholic leaders who had certainly no small role to play in the success of the American Revolution. And all of them pretty much coming from outside of the colonies. None of these that I'm going to mention here, at least military leaders, were born in the colonies. They're all foreign born and coming to the United States, coming to the colonies, either to assist primarily in the Revolution or coming to the colonies later on before the Revolution even began. And many of them you're probably already familiar with their names, such as Tadeusz Kościuszko. Maybe you've heard of Kościuszko. 1746 to 1817, he was a Polish military engineer. You'd never guess it by his name. Serving as a colonel in the Continental Army, he was a great architect, a great military architect. And he helped to build many of the important forts and fortifications of the Continental Army, particularly helping to bring to completion in many ways West Point. So he's kind of seen as a great father of West Point. He was promoted to brigadier general in 1783, and after the war he returned to his native Poland to fight for Polish freedom against the Russians and the Prussians. But when he left the United States after the war was concluded, after the government was established, he left all of his assets, he left all of the winnings and the salary that he had made as a great military figure. He left all of it to be endowed for the education and the freedom of slaves. So he, even though he was foreign born, even though he really didn't have much at stake, we might say, in the American Revolution, he still had, because of his Catholic faith, we would say, this great desire to ensure that all people were free. Another Polish man that you might be familiar with, maybe more so than Kościuszko, is Kazimierz Pulaski. I think we've heard of Pulaski Square, maybe, and I think, so anyways, 1745 to 1779. So he died as a member of the Continental Army. He's the father of the American cavalry, saving the life of General George Washington. And when he died as a result of wounds from the siege in Savannah, Georgia, and he is one of only 8 people, this was an interesting fact about him, one of only 8 people to be given an honorary U.S. citizenship. Now, he was given it posthumously in 2009. Some of the others, only 2 of the 8 were given the honorary citizenship in their own life, Mother Teresa being one of them. But Winston Churchill being another one, William Penn and his wife receiving it posthumously, and a couple others that I'm going to mention. But he was very much in high esteem by George Washington. He really took him under his arm, helped to train him, helped to show him the way, and he saw him as a great friend. And he wrote to Washington his sentiments and his desire to help join the Continental Army, and he said, "I come here where freedom is being defended, to serve it, to live, or die for it." And he did die for it, and we thank him for that. Another one, maybe you've heard of him, Jean-Baptiste de Vimour, or maybe you've heard of him as the Count of Rochambeau. 1725 to 1807, he was commander-in-chief of the French Expeditionary Force, so he was the general in charge of the French troops who were coming as allies for the Americans, very much important in the American victory. So Kosciuszko and Pulaski coming from Poland, Rochambeau obviously from France, these deep-seated Catholic nations formed these great leaders, and some of them, like Kosciuszko and Pulaski, coming on their own accord, or Rochambeau being sent by the French monarchy himself. But it didn't allow them to stop practicing their faith. They were still practitioners of it as much as they could during the war here in the colonies, and they continued to be outstanding people of faith, very much helping to change the tide of many of the sentiments of the founding fathers. Another great, and probably one of the greatest of all of these men, was the Marquis de Lafayette, coming here to the colonies to assist at just the young age of 19 years old. He was an outstanding military officer, general in the Continental Army at such a young age, and he impressed many by his youth, particularly Washington, who really in many ways saw him as his own son, saw him as a great person to not only help lead the American Revolution, but later on to help in the French revolutions as well, and another one to receive honorary US citizenship. Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse, he was a French naval officer helping to win in the Battle of the Chesapeake, making the way for the Battle of Yorktown, the deciding battle in the American Revolution. Stephen Moylan, Irish-born, he was a muster master general. Makes me think of a musical, doesn't it? Muster Master General. He was secretary and aide-de-camp to George Washington. So Washington surrounded himself by many different people, some of them being Catholics, and to be an aide-de-camp to Washington really was to be his right-hand man, to be somebody that he would look to not only for assistance in battle or assistance at the camp, but for advice, and not just military, but in many ways philosophical and even spiritual advice many of his aides have written. And John Barry, he was also Irish-born. He is claimed to be the father of the American Navy, along with John Paul Jones and John Adams. And he, we have probably the most evidence for his devout faith out of all of these men, because we have his diaries and we have the accounts of the sailors who sailed with him, that he would begin each and every day, even and particularly when he was at sea, by reading his Bible, by making sure that his sailors were well taken care of, by being a man of great faith and great virtue. Another one who's not pictured is John Fitzgerald, another aide-de-camp, another Catholic, devout Catholic who helped Washington in his need. So, as I said, in many ways, we can see these people as just names, just dates, kind of just random figures maybe we might be thinking. But we have to think of it in the mindset of for the Continental Congress to allow these men to be such important figures in the Continental Army. They weren't just sacrificing their own values as a matter of winning the war, but it was softening their hearts, it was softening the prejudice that many of them had because of their Protestant upbringing. And it really helped them to change the tide of the American people. Another quote or another look at how this anti-Catholic sentiment was really prominent at the time. In one of the, many times school children at the time would learn different poems or little sayings to help them learn things. And one of them they learned against the Catholic Church, not surprisingly. And so, think of nice little school children singing or humming this along as they went home from school. Abhor that errant whore of Rome and all her blasphemies, and drink not of her cursed cup, obey not her decrees. Nice little, like Mary had a little lamb kind of rhyme, isn't that nice? But that's really what many of the founding fathers were growing up on. That's what was deep-seated within them from their childhood. That not only these military leaders, but the other political leaders that represented the Catholics helped to soften, helped to show that, there's no such thing as the Catholic boogeyman. There's no such thing as the Pope coming in and staking his claim to the American colonies, even though that was very much a well-thought opinion. So these military leaders help not only to show the Catholic faith, but without them, particularly Marquis de Lafayette and others, we can't say for sure whether we would have won the revolution. That's how instrumental they were. And Washington and others themselves attest to the fact that without their help, it would have been difficult, particularly without the help of the French. But it wasn't simply in military terms that the Catholics were helping to lead the way, but particularly in politics, where they were having one-on-one discussions and debates with the other founding fathers, that the Catholics were able to help show their case, help to show their faith. I've already mentioned Charles Carroll of Carrollton, again being the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. And I've already mentioned his cousin, Daniel Carroll, who represented Maryland, one of only 5 people to sign the Articles of Confederation in 1781 and the U.S. Constitution in 1789. But another Catholic who signed the Constitution was Thomas Fitzsimmons, representing not Maryland but Pennsylvania, again showing the great population of Catholics in Pennsylvania itself, and also the great role of freedom of religion having to do in the colony and the state of Pennsylvania. But besides these 3, there was also the role, maybe not so much of politics, but also of economics and helping to fund the revolution. So one of these men was Dominic Lynch. He was an Irish-born merchant. Now, he didn't come to the United States until after the revolution had concluded, but because of his work as a merchant, because of his own personal wealth, he was able to be a very influential person in these formational early years of the nation. And he founded the city of Rome, New York, originally being called Lynchville, but later being renamed to Rome in New York State. And interestingly, he and his wife, both Catholics, were 2 of only 300 people to be invited to George Washington's inaugural ball in 1789. So he was a personal friend of George Washington and continued to have influence on American politics afterwards. And so we can really begin to talk about, thinking and putting our mindset still in the midst of the Revolutionary War, and also looking a little bit afterwards as the nation is being formed, that religious freedom is finally beginning to prevail. That, as I've already talked about the great influence of Catholic leaders, of Charles Carroll, of Daniel Carroll, of Thomas Fitzsimmons, and of Bishop John Carroll in his own way, it wasn't only the Catholics who were helping to model religious freedom, but George Washington himself had such an important role, and really it was probably his role, probably his actions taken during the war and outside of the war, that really helped to form the mindset of other founding fathers. And you have to think, George Washington is trying to help lead and rule this fledgling army of volunteers from all over the colonies. They're of different beliefs, they're of different backgrounds, coming from English and Irish and Scottish, some of them German or French, and having all kinds of different ideas and thoughts. And for Washington, religion being a very important thing to him, religion had to be not a way of division, but a way of unity for his troops, as he sought to bring the Continental Army into one, rather than having soldiers fighting against each other in the camps. So probably one of the most famous things that George Washington did among his troops was the ban of what's called Guy Fawkes Day. So Guy Fawkes Day was a British holiday. In some ways, it's still celebrated in England. It celebrated the fooling of what was thought to be a Catholic attempt on blowing up the Parliament in England. They thought that the Catholics were trying to blow up Parliament, and they found these Catholics hiding in Westminster, and they arrested them and executed them. And so they celebrated this day as kind of victory over the Catholics, as kind of the British outsmarting the Catholics every year by having Guy Fawkes Day. They would build kind of scarecrows or wooden effigies of the Pope, of bishops, of priests, and then they would burn them. And they would kind of have a little festival around it and whatnot. And you can imagine this really didn't sit well with the Catholics. It didn't sit well with George Washington either. So he banned the celebration of Guy Fawkes Day among the Continental Army as a way of beginning this road towards religious freedom, this road to religious toleration that he already saw as an important key in the American Revolution and in the American dream. And he didn't just ban Guy Fawkes Day, but he called for a total following and toleration of religious freedom, not just in the Continental Army, but he advocated for it among the other founding fathers and the members of the Continental Congress. And this is where our little handout comes in, because really we see the beauty of Washington's view of the Catholics exemplified in his letter to American Catholics. So our little packet here consists of two different letters. So following Washington's election as president, different groups, different representatives of the different religions, ethnicities, and groups around the newly formed United States were writing letters of congratulations, of prayer, of blessing, of different things to George Washington. And he would often respond to them kind of en masse. So where, John Carroll and other Catholic leaders kind of gathered letters from all around the country and sent them to Washington, he then wrote a single letter back to all the Catholics. So we see the first page, front and back, being the letter that was kind of combined together by John Carroll and signed also by Charles Carroll, Daniel Carroll, Thomas Fitzsimmons, and Dominic Lynch, all these people that I've talked about a little bit already. And you can read through that and see the great blessing that they're asking upon Washington, that they see him as an example of vigilance, of influence on laws, of manners towards fellow citizens, encouraging the respect of religion, all these things that he was already doing before the war, or in the midst of the war, rather. But the second page, the second piece of paper there, is Washington's response. Washington's letter to Roman Catholics on the 15th of March, 1790. So he begins with, appreciating their congratulations, his unanimous vote as president. And he goes on to say in the second paragraph, "I feel that my conduct in war and in peace has met with more general approbation than could reasonably have been expected. And I find myself disposed to consider that fortunate circumstance in a great degree, resulting from the able support and extraordinary candor of my fellow citizens of all denominations." He sees it not just as a victory for Catholics, not just as a victory for Presbyterians or Episcopalians, but as something that has come together of all the denominations coming together as one. And he goes on to say that he sees America, sees the freedom and independence that they have gained under the smiles of divine providence, the protection of good government, the cultivation of manners, morals, and piety, cannot fail of attaining an uncommon degree of eminence in literature, commerce, agriculture, improvements. All of this is a way of him saying he sees all of this new nation to be founded, this new nation in formation, that it cannot fail. It needs to do this in order to succeed, to have not just a common degree of eminence, a common degree of respect, but an uncommon and an extra degree of eminence for this respective religion. And he goes on to thank them, thanks the society, kind of referring to the Society of Jesus and the Society of Catholics, who are animated alone by the pure spirit of Christianity, he says in the final paragraph there. So he sees them not as, the division between Christians and Catholics, but he sees the great goodness of the unity of the Christians, both Catholic and Protestant. And so you can read later on a little bit about the letter that John Carroll kind of formed together from the other letters of the Catholics, and a little bit more of Washington's response as well. And online there are numerous letters from Washington to all the different religious groups that wrote to him that are all very interesting. But as we're talking about Washington, as we're talking about his respect for religious freedom, it kind of brings up an interesting historical question. You might remember last time we looked at the question of whether Miles Standish, the great commander of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts, if he himself was Catholic, never becoming a part of the Pilgrim Church, possibly being from a Catholic family in England. Well, there's similar questions regarding George Washington that you might find surprising. None of this is definitive. It's still in many ways debated by historians, many saying that, we just don't have enough information. Many of them saying George Washington was such a devout Anglican, such a seer of, even though he was pro-religious freedom, he saw maybe the division that could have come about if he would have openly converted to Catholicism. So there's many who doubt it, but there might be some reasons to believe it. So as I mentioned, he surrounded himself by many Catholics, both in his aides-de-camp and in his other generals and military leaders that he befriended and surrounded himself with. Pictured here is an image of the Blessed Virgin that was kept in his room in the White House and in Mount Vernon, and was really, many people saw as important to him. We're not sure where it came from, if it was given to him by a gift, maybe from one of his aides-de-camp, maybe by Marquis de Lafayette, maybe simply as a token of appreciation from a Catholic in response to winning the war. But he kept it in such a prominent place, not a public place, but a private place in his own rooms. And finally, maybe most interesting of all, he called for a priest while he was on his deathbed. So while Washington lay dying the evening of December 14th, 1799, after having served as president, after desiring to return and retire to Mount Vernon, he was out riding, he had gotten wet, came back, and really became sick, and he had already somewhat been sickly and never recovered. So knowing that his time was near, he called not for an Episcopalian, not for a Presbyterian minister, but he called for a Catholic priest. And Father Leonard Neal, a Jesuit living right up the Potomac River, who would later become the second Bishop of Baltimore, he came to Washington's deathbed and spent 4 hours with him. We have no record of what was said, what was done, what was discussed. None of the other attestations of Washington on his deathbed, of his final words, of anything, speak of him converting or anything. But when Father Leonard returned to the Jesuits up the stream of the Potomac at St. Thomas, there's a tradition that was passed down among the Jesuits there that Father Leonard did receive his baptism, that he did hear his confession and convert him to the Catholic faith. but that was never, in many ways, written down finally. That was never really given much credit or much evidence, except for passing down of this legend by word of mouth. So we can't be certain, we're probably less certain even about Washington's conversion as we are about the possibility of Miles Standish being Catholic. But it is an interesting question to pose and to think about. Could George Washington have become Catholic on his deathbed? Could he have fought, who had fought for such religious freedom and toleration of Catholics in particular, could he have held within his heart this desire to convert that he knew might have torn the nation apart if he had done it while he was still alive and well, let alone when he was president? And so he waited until his deathbed to do it in private, alone before him and God. We'll never know, but it's an interesting question to think about. So now we can look at really the birth of the American church post-revolution. We can see how the Catholic Church, can begin to flourish in the new nation, can really take advantage of the religious freedom that had been allowed in the Constitution. So, as a little bit of a background, when we're talking about the hierarchy of the church, there's always some bishop or group or level of hierarchy that's in charge of some area. So during the colonial period, the colonies would have been, all the Catholics in the colonies would have been under the control or under the influence of what was called the Apostolic Vicariate of London. They couldn't have a diocese or an actual bishop in London because of the British kicking all the Catholics out, of course. But in 1784, after the Americans had won the Revolution, the American Catholics no longer wanted to be under the control of this vicariate in London, and so they petitioned the Vatican to have their own, what's called an apostolic prefecture, which is kind of a prelude to a diocese, that being established in November of 1784. And unsurprisingly, John Carroll was named its first superior of missions by Pope Pius VI, pictured there. And John Carroll, in this role as not as bishop yet, but as superior of the missions in America, writes the first report to what's called the Propaganda Fide, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith that oversaw all the mission territories. And here he lays out what the church looked like in America. We have a great snapshot of what the Catholic Church looked like in the new beginnings of the United States. So he gives this very detailed report to the Vatican about the state of the church. He says, in Maryland, there are nearly 16,000 Catholics, 9,000 freemen, adults are 12 years older, children under 12 being about 3,000, and above that number, slaves of all ages of African origin. In Pennsylvania, there are 7,000, very few of them Africans, and Catholics are less scattered, live nearer to each other around the city of Philadelphia. In Virginia, there are not more than 200, very small but still there, who are visited 4 or 5 times a year by a priest. Imagine only having a priest available 4 or 5 times throughout the year. Many other Catholics are said to be scattered in this and that other states who are utterly deprived of all religious ministry. He goes on to say that there are 19 priests in Maryland, 5 in Pennsylvania, and 2 or more are 70 years or older, 3 more being near that age. So of the 24 priests that he had in the new United States, 5 of them are quite elderly and not able to move around very much. He says they're almost entirely unfit to undergo the hardships without which the vineyard of the Lord cannot be cultivated. Of the remaining priests, some are in very bad health. One recently approved for a few months' rest. and the extreme want of priests is the greatest trial. You can imagine that as Catholics are spread out all throughout the United States, that the priests there are traveling over and over and over just to, in some ways, give the minimal sacraments needed. And John Carroll goes on to explain the different roles of piety and how different Catholics in different regions are able to follow the faith. And he goes into great detail in this first report, but it gives us an interesting snapshot of what the Catholics in the early nation looked like. And finally, we can get to the actual founding of the American Church in the U.S., we might say. With the Apostolic Bull Ex Hoc Apostolicae, Pope Pius VI established the see, the Diocese of Baltimore, in 1789, naming John Carroll as its first bishop, who was consecrated a bishop in Europe, came back to the United States, installed in the first cathedral, or the pro-cathedral of St. Peter in the city of Baltimore. And there he began the construction later in the early 1800s of this building here, which is considered America's first cathedral. It's the Basilica of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Baltimore. It's no longer the cathedral. The cathedral had been moved some years ago, but it's still a beautiful building, and you go into it, you walk into it, and at first you're not exactly sure if it's Catholic, because it has this what we might think of as New England colonial, white walls, very linear, very simple and plain. And then you see the beautiful high altar and tabernacle and the bishop's seat. And so he really made it not as kind of a great symbol of the old Catholic rule in Europe, the great Gothic cathedrals, but really wanted to match it to kind of the sentiment of Americans already present in the nation. And we can go on and on about different things that the early Catholics were experiencing in their daily life in the nation. 1789, the same year of the founding of the Diocese of Baltimore, is what's considered the establishment year for Georgetown University. It was the first federally chartered university because later on it was within the territory of Washington, D.C. And this was really a great accomplishment for the Jesuits and for the Catholics in the nation, because for decades they had desired to establish a college, a place of higher education for Catholics. And because of the laws against Catholics, they just weren't able to do so. So again, another fruit of religious freedom was being able to open this great Catholic university. There was variety among piety and practice as people had to adjust their Catholic faith because of not having priests as available as they might like. An interesting effect of the freedom of religion and the spread of Catholicism in the early United States is we have the printing of the first American Catholic Bible in 1790. And it was not an easy accomplishment, but the printer who published it he himself was a Catholic, and he wanted to provide something to replace the King James or to oppose the King James, which he was able to convince and show many Protestants also, not just Catholics, that the Douay-Rheims, the Old English translation of the Bible, was really superior to the Anglican King James. So he was able to garner a lot of money around it, a lot of investment, and be able to successfully print it in 1790. This first Catholic Bible for American Catholics to read. And you can imagine it was really only for the wealthy. There's different issues that come up in the early United States that I just don't have the time to go into. Lay trusteeism has to do with who's actually owning the church, the parish building. Right now we think of it as the diocese. It's the bishop who really owns all the church property. But for the early United States, it was the individuals in a community who went in together in owning and buying and paying for the building of a church. And so they were the trustees, they were the real owners. And so that led to many disputes among bishops and priests and parishioners alike. The first national parish was a German parish, Holy Trinity in Philadelphia, being established in the late 1700s. But as we continue on, and this will really flow well into our next chronological discussion on the church in the United States, the faith quickly continued to grow, and soon Bishop John Carroll realized that he couldn't supply the priests. He himself could not be bishop of such a large and varied territory. So he petitioned Rome to split up the United States, and it was growing even more then into different dioceses. So in 1808, the Pope made 4 new dioceses in the United States, so 4 new bishops in the United States. And some of these are pretty self-explanatory. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and what would be the 4th? Oh, certainly you wouldn't forget Bardstown, Kentucky. That just rolls off the tongue. Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Bardstown. Okay. It is a nice city. So these new bishops, none of them were born or really present much in the United States before they're being made bishops. Bishop Concannon was an Irish Dominican who became the first bishop of New York. Bishop Egan was a Franciscan, Irish-born Franciscan, was the Bishop of Philadelphia. And surprisingly, we would often think Boston, the Irish, they didn't have an Irish bishop for their first one. But Bishop Cheverus, maybe if you've been around Boston, I think there's a Cheverus High School or school around there. He was a French-born diocesan priest, and he was in Boston as bishop for 15 years before returning to France and later becoming a cardinal and archbishop of Bordeaux in France. And then poor Bardstown. Bishop Benedict Joseph Flagett was a Sulpician father, and he was bishop of the Diocese of Bardstown from its founding in 1808 till it was suppressed, till it died in 1841. But even after those 33 years of service, he was not done because he became the first bishop of the transferred Diocese of Louisville, Kentucky, from 1841 till his death in 1850, being a bishop in the United States for 42 years when he died at the age of 87. And he has an account that I'll go into next time about his trip to Bardstown and what he found when he encountered the small but very faithful group of Catholics in the Kentucky Valley. These opened up so many new frontiers as the nation continued to spread, continued to grow, that we'll go into more detail the next time we talk about the chronology of the United States. But to give you a little foretaste, we'll talk about the Kentucky frontier with Bishop Flagett and the interesting aspect of the West, which Kentucky was at the time. What was the West able to promote, able to give to the Catholics and to the American nation? Later, the Louisiana Purchase and in New Orleans and in St. Louis, the great population of Catholics that were already present there that we alluded to last month as well. And as the same time that the United States is growing geographically, we see the start of trickles of influx of immigration, particularly Catholic immigration that will only continue to grow, that really helps to shape the face of the United States as it continues to move further and further west. So as we will look later on about this Western expansion of the United States, as it becomes a little bit more familiar and a little bit more what we're used to seeing of the United States, it doesn't get much easier for the Catholics necessarily. You know, the time around the Revolution and post-Revolution early years of the nation were really, in many ways, a golden age for the Catholics in the first few decades or even first century of the nation, because unfortunately later on in the 1800s, the Catholic prejudice continues to come back, particularly as we see different religious orders come in, different immigrants from Catholic nations come in, and the Protestants and many American leaders not understanding what these Catholics are all about and what they're actually trying to do. Not take over the nation for the Pope, but rather to simply live in the freedoms and justice that the United States was meant to be for all. So that really brings us to conclusion for tonight. As I said, this was really a deep dive into just a few decades of the Church's history here in the United States, but it really gives us a glimpse of this great age of Catholics, this great age of influence for Catholics in the early United States, and how we were able to overcome many of these prejudices that were long-standing and present so as to live as true citizens. As I had mentioned, Charles Carroll, his pen name when he was writing his newspaper articles was the citizen or the first citizen, and he meant that not because he thought himself as some great figure, but because he wanted to show others that he could be both a citizen and a Catholic. A fight that the Catholics would continue to have for decades and even longer to come in American history. So as a little preview to next time, we're going to be getting off track from our chronological look at the United States and American Catholics, and we're going to be turning to our first outbreak of topics as I look at the Catholic women who shaped America, as we partner with the Awakening Ministry here at St. Albert the Great and look at the great impact for March, which also happens to be a Women History Month, as we look at the impact of American Catholic women in the Church and in the United States in particular. So I hope that you're able to come back on Wednesday, March 18th for that. But in the meantime, continue to read up in all your interesting facts and tidbits about American Catholic history. And I forgot to mention, there will be a quiz when we come to the end in December, so keep good notes. But otherwise, have a blessed evening, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much.